When I made this video on the repositioning problem, I got a ton of pushback, most of which was incredibly respectful. Kind critics sparked insightful conversations and really held my feet to the fire. And after a few hundred comments, I finally realized that not only were most of them highly critical of my views, I agreed with them. People were right to criticize that video because it had a lot of flaws. I didn't do the repositioning problem nearly the justice it deserved. So, after reading a ton of feedback and really thinking my ideas through properly, I've decided to make this video defending the repositioning problem as a legitimate issue in Hollow Knight. So to you, my dear viewer, if you don't already agree that this is a problem, by the end of this video, hopefully you will. Hello and welcome back. I'm Holland and we've got a lot to get through in this video, so I'll cut the small talk short. If you haven't watched my original video on the repositioning problem, I'll link to it down below. However, you don't need to have watched it to understand this video. Alright, let's get into it. Let me first take a brief moment to define the repositioning problem. The repositioning problem is the alarming lack of proper telegraphing on dangerous repositioning moves, which, like all attacks, should be sufficiently telegraphed to allow the player time to respond. Here I do make a couple of assertions. I promise I'll qualify each of them, but let me start by telling you why I think a repositioning move in some cases can be considered an attack. Take an action like Hornet's Jump or Traitor Lord's Walk. These moves are meant to relocate the boss from one place in the arena to another, to reposition them, but since both Hornet and Traitor Lord can deal collision damage, their body essentially becomes a weapon while they reposition. And as such, these moves, what I call dangerous repositioning moves, can essentially be considered attacks. This part, people seem to largely agree with, that most repositioning moves are essentially attacks. However, whether not telegraphing such moves is in fact a major error in game design seems much more disputed. So, having taken the time to think through the issue properly, let me tell you why I think not telegraphing attacks properly is a bad design choice that leads to less fairness, more frustrating gameplay, and an overall worse player experience. I believe the repositioning problem can be divided into two lesser components, the reaction component and the intuition component. The first of the two components of the repositioning problem is the reaction component. If an attack isn't telegraphed, it cannot be dodged. Here I define dodged as the player consciously giving an input to avoid taking damage. So if you're lucky enough to be in an area the boss doesn't threaten, you haven't dodged anything according to my definition. You just got lucky. I don't believe there can be any arguing against this assertion. If an attack isn't telegraphed, it cannot be dodged. Think about it. How can you actively avoid something you don't know is coming, even in theory? Now, you might try to come up with counterexamples. Notably, some may argue that dodging repositioning moves is possible even though they don't have proper telegraphs. Of course you can move out of the way when Hornet jumps, at least sometimes. And you're right, that is true, but here's why. If you're standing far enough away from a boss when he jumps, and you're able to read the curve of the jump itself becomes the telegraph. So you're only able to dodge the attack because it does gain a tell, and as such, you are in fact responding to a telegraph. This also means that if you're too close to the boss and in the way of his trajectory, the move loses its telegraph and can no longer be dodged. Okay, all good so far? Let's zoom out for a moment and look at the only three options for avoiding an attack in Hollow Knight. 1. Noticing a telegraph and dodging out of the way. 2. Consciously being out of reach of the boss. 3. Unconsciously being out of reach of the boss. If you remove the telegraph from an attack, as in the case of most repositioning moves, you're left with only the last two options: staying away from the potentially dangerous areas of the arena, or being lucky enough to occupy a safe spot when the boss performs its attack. Here, I'm gonna make an assumption. I think most of us can agree that option 3 isn't good game design. You don't want players to only be able to dodge attacks just by being lucky. Not that you shouldn't be able to do so, just that if luck were your only option, the boss would be poorly designed. So, this is where a lot of folks argue that option 2 is the reason why the reaction component, and in turn the repositioning problem as a whole, is not a problem. Here's my steel man of that argument as I understand it. We agree that if an attack isn't telegraphed, it cannot be dodged. However, not every attack needs to be dodged. Some should instead be predicted. If you're a newcomer to the Hornet fight, for example, you're most likely gonna die at least a few times because you don't know the fight yet. That's okay though, such is the nature of the game. But as you keep fighting her, you'll not only learn her telegraphs, but also a few implicit rules of the fight. Mainly that staying in the air, especially right above Hornet, is a bad idea. You'll learn this through trial and error, and eventually you'll know to keep to the ground through most of the fight. This is part of getting good at the encounter, and although you'll never be able to react to Hornet if you're too close to her, you'll learn not to go above her in the first place, avoiding the problem entirely. If you agreed with that summary, I hear you. I'd like to shake your hand, look you in the eyes, and let you know that I don't think you're crazy. I think ultimately you are wrong, but I do understand where you're coming from. I'll revisit this contention later on. For now, the reaction component. If an attack isn't telegraphed, it cannot be dodged. You might agree with this, but still think it doesn't make untelegraphed attacks poor design. That's totally fine. I'm not luring you into a trap. I just hope we can all agree on this first premise. So, one final time. If an attack isn't telegraphed, it cannot be dodged. The second part of the repositioning problem is the intuition component. A good attack should intuitively show you where you are not allowed to go. Let me give you an example. In this picture, the Hollow Knight has brought back his nail. Now, where do you think he's about to strike? I think even if you've never faced this boss before, your guess would be right in front of him. That's right, and now you instantly know where you're not allowed to be in the arena. Sure, you might not know exactly where you're not allowed to go if you're a first timer. Notably, this attack from the Hollow Knight has quite a wide reach. But you do understand that you can at least go above or behind the boss to avoid getting hit. In other words, this telegraph communicates very clearly where you're allowed to be in the arena. Does that make the incoming attack necessarily easy to dodge? Well, no, I don't think so at all. Plenty of difficult bosses have solid telegraphs. I'll avoid showing any spoilers, but Pure Vessel, for those of you who know him, is a prime example of a well-telegraphed boss who's also quite difficult to beat. As a quick tangent, this was another piece of criticism I received multiple times on my original video. That if bosses were to telegraph their repositioning moves, they would get too easy because you could just pogo them to death without issue. And while I am sympathetic to the concern, I don't think that argument holds water. 3 of the toughest fights in the game, Grim, Pure Vessel, and the Radiance, are all quite fair when it comes to repositioning. They rarely pull cheap tricks like Hornet or Broken Vessel. And, coincidentally, or not so coincidentally perhaps, they're also 3 of the most well-liked bosses in the game. If you still believe that encounters like Hornet or Broken Vessel would become too easy by downslashing were you to give their repositioning moves a proper telegraph, okay, fair enough. But then let's fix the issue in a proper manner, not with a sporadic jump, but with a telegraphed attack. For example, and this is just an example, like the Mantis Warriors in Fungal Wastes who have an upslash to counter pogoing. Fights becoming too easy isn't a good argument for keeping a bad game mechanic, although it might be a good argument for needing to increase the difficulty of the fight once you remove that bad mechanic. Returning to the intuition component, I think Hollow Knight generally does a great job at intuitively showing you where not to go when the boss performs an attack. Repositioning moves, however, completely toss intuition out the window. Let me illustrate how with another example. I'm going to color in the areas that may lead to you taking damage in red. Here's the rough danger zone for Hornet's lunge attack. Makes sense, right? Because she's crouching down, bringing back her nail, you intuit she's about to lunge forward. If you wanted to avoid this attack, you would instantly know where to go, up and over her. But then, and this is the important part, here's the rough danger zone for her repositioning move. Look at that. She can go anywhere she wants to, so the danger zone looks absurd. And moreover, she's not even communicating this danger with a telegraph, she's just standing there. And now look what happens when I show both of them one after the other. Hornet starts in her idle position, threatening a huge part of the arena. Then she goes into a crouch, dramatically limiting her potential threat even though she's now actually about to attack you. And then, coming out of the lunge, she returns to threatening almost the entire arena. You can argue this is fair. You can argue this is just something you have to get used to. What I don't think you can argue is that this is intuitive. And I think intuition is such a huge part of what makes Hollow Knight bosses fun and non-frustrating. When you die to an intuitive attack, you think, yeah, that one was on me. I saw it coming and I responded incorrectly. When you die to an unintuitive attack, you think, come on, give me a break. That's why I assert the following. A good attack should intuitively show you where you are not allowed to go. I gotta return to that clip again because I think it illustrates the intuition component perfectly. Notice what happens. Hornet covers all of this area just by idling. Then, as soon as she crouches down, she becomes so much weaker. She's now only covering this small little area, which is made even less threatening by the fact that she's indicating what she's about to do. And look, as soon as she's done lunging, she instantly becomes 10 times more dangerous. Even though she's just standing there inconspicuously idling. No telegraph to indicate this potential danger, completely unintuitive. You might not feel like this is a big problem while you're playing, because like driving without a seatbelt, most of the time nothing happens. The boss jumps to a spot where you're not standing, or you were far enough away from the boss to where you could still get out of the way. But some of the time, you're not so lucky. And that's when you start to notice how little in control you are when Lost Kin decides he wants to jump across the entire arena to get you. Finally, let me take a quick moment to show you what this example would look like if Hornet did properly telegraph her repositioning move. First, the entire arena, apart from Hornet herself, is safe. You can be wherever you want to be, which makes complete sense since the boss isn't preparing to attack you. Then, Hornet makes some of the arena dangerous by preparing to lunge, still wholly intuitive as you can tell what she's about to do just by looking at her sprite. Coming out of the lunge, the arena once again becomes safe. And finally, now that she's decided she wants to reposition, she crouches down for a second or two, letting you know that she's about to jump. Only now does most of the arena become dangerous and you're no longer free to roam around. But in this case, you would have the time to safely reach the ground before she jumped, making the attack a whole lot fairer than it was before. This part is perhaps the most important in the entire video. I want to summarize the reaction component and the intuition component, and then tell you which of two camps of argumentation I think you have to fall into. The reaction component doesn't assert any value. It just claims that for a player to be able to respond to an attack, that attack has to be telegraphed. This in turn also applies to dangerous repositioning moves. So hopefully you agree with that. I don't know quite where to take you unless you do, because I think the argument is, in fact, a matter of logical consistency, in the sense that it logically follows that a non-telegraphed attack cannot be consciously dodged. Let's say you agree with the reaction component, but you don't agree that the repositioning problem is a problem. I think that places you in the position of having to argue that predicting an attack can be just about as fun and/or skillful as reading a telegraph and responding to one. You can't know when Hornet is about to perform a jump, you just have to predict that she might and therefore never be in the air unless she's in the middle of performing another attack. This is where I think the intuition component comes into play. A good attack should intuitively show you where you are not allowed to go. In contrast to the reaction component, here I am actually asserting value. I'm telling you that I think a good attack should be intuitive. It should allow you to read a visual indicator on screen and know how to respond. It's like if I told you yellow and then punched you in the face if you didn't immediately get out of the way, instead of me saying get out of the way and then expecting the same. A move that visually tells you to get out of the way is more well designed than one that tells you yellow and then expects you to know what that means. But remember, this is only half of the argument that an attack should be intuitive. Hornet's repositioning move isn't just unintuitive, it's also completely unpredictable vis-a-vis the reaction component. I'm not even telling you yellow, I'm just expecting you to never be around me of fear I might punch you at any time out of nowhere. So not only do you have to play it safe and constantly stay near the ground against Hornet, even though she might not actually jump for the next 5 moves, you also have no way of intuiting that the skies are always dangerous because she never directly communicates it. If you, again, posit that this is not a problem, let me once again steelman your position. I think in this case you have to argue the following. Even though I can't know when Hornet will jump next, knowing that she might and therefore restricting myself to never being in the air is either fun, shows off my skill, and or displays my knowledge of the fight. I do not ascribe to this view. I think it's neither fun nor skillful to stay on the ground for the entire fight. I don't think unintuitive boss design is ever superior to the alternative, and I think you can have everything you like about the current system without almost any of the flaws. However, if you do subscribe to this view, at least I appreciate that you're being logically consistent in your rejection of the repositioning problem as a problem. One circumstance which I fear obfuscates this issue for many veteran Hollow Knight players is habituation. Once you learn how to cope with the unintuitive repositioning problem, there's a very good chance that you become so used to the boss playing unfairly that you forget how many hoops you're constantly jumping through to compensate. A good way to refresh your mind and see things from a new perspective is to simply watch a new player engage with the game. However fast they are at learning the basics of Hollow Knight, you can rest assured they'll take about 4 times as long to understand the hidden nonsensical rules of repositioning. Take now as a prime example Ellie from Wilson 108. Like a diligent scientist, Wilson is on a journey of exposing Ellie to the wonderful world of gaming and documenting her experiences for us to dissect. In this instance, Ellie has been playing Hollow Knight for a total of 7 hours when she encounters Hornet. Notice in this gameplay how relatively comfortable Ellie is with dodging Hornet's attacks, even though she still lacks confidence in the fight. She's managing to read the boss's telegraphs and get out of the way, even if just by the skin of her teeth. Now, take a look at this clip.
God damn it.
Notice how Ellie manages to dodge the telegraphed attack, turns around to jump over Hornet, but is then immediately punished. I popped this clip into an editing software and was astonished to find less than 1/3 of a second between Hornet's first frame of telegraphing and Ellie taking damage. That's less than 1/4 of a second if she had actually wanted to dodge the attack. Is that a good way to welcome Ellie to this wonderful game? Or is that the repositioning problem showing itself bright as day? And remember, that move isn't just unfair to Ellie, it's equally as unfair towards all of us. Some of us have just gotten used to the abuse. If you can see the logic behind the reaction component and agree with the intuition component, I think we're on the same page. So then let's finally move on from diagnosis to prognosis. In my first video on the repositioning problem, I offered 4 potential solutions. What I perhaps didn't make clear is that 3 of those I found quite unappealing myself. I didn't think they solved the issue in its entirety. But importantly, after reading all of your wonderful comments, I've come to even dislike the 4th solution. Critics pointed out that showing the trajectory and landing spot of bosses in white markings would not fit Hollow Knight very well at all. I agree with this criticism. In the wake of making that video and reading the feedback, I was feeling quite confused. What solution could there possibly be to the problem then? And then I read this comment, and I just loved every part of it. Ideas for boss tells. Hornet. Small blades of grass will be violently blown in the wind in the area Hornet is jumping to. Broken vessel. Small globs of infection will peer out of a crack in the area the broken vessel is jumping to. Crystal Guardian. Small crystals will jut out of the ground in the area the Crystal Guardian is jumping to. What Mike was suggesting didn't just inspire me to include his comment in this video, it inspired me to make the video. In the moment I read it, I just imagined what these tells might look like inside of the game, and I thought to myself, that's it. That's Hollow Knight. So, here's my final solution to the repositioning problem, knowing full well that I'm a flawed thinker and that no solution is ever truly final. 1. Every attack, meaning every hitbox change with potential to damage the player that does not already have a sufficiently long telegraph to allow player response, should get one. 2. Every repositioning move that does not have a clear destination point should reveal its destination with a tell based on the theme of the boss. So in other words, every attack with an insufficiently long telegraph, which primarily includes repositioning moves, should get a longer telegraph. For example, having the boss crouch down for an additional second before jumping. And for moves like Hornets or Broken Vessels jump, Mike's suggestion would be applied. Blades of grass blowing in the wind, small blobs of infection peering out of the ground, etc. Also note that for moves like Brooding Morloc's jump or Broken Vessel's slam that already have predictable targets, only the increased telegraph length would be required. To me, this is a very happy compromise. The one problem that isn't fully addressed is showing to the player the exact trajectory that the boss will take. What you instead have to do is read the boss's repositioning telegraph, notice where the boss wants to jump to, and then infer the trajectory yourself. And while that still might take some extra work for someone new to the game like Ellie, it ultimately gives control back to the player, allowing them to intuit the path of the boss and dodge out of the way before getting hit. You know, what's funny is that I can sit here for hours writing about one specific issue in Hollow Knight, come to a satisfying conclusion, and yet still remain ultimately ignorant in the final analysis. I'm no more of a philosopher of game design than you are, and that's why I try to be as modest in my assertions as I can muster. So while I do truly believe that the repositioning problem is a real problem, I'm very open to criticism. And as long as you're respectful about it, you're always more than welcome to share your thoughts down in the comments below. And that's all she wrote. Thank you so much for watching. Massive credit goes to Wilson and Ellie for letting me use their footage as a case study, as well as to Mike Does Things for inspiring me to make this video. A link to Wilson108's channel can be found in the description below. Please go check him out, he's phenomenal and so is Ellie. And finally, if you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. Those two things really help out the channel a lot more than you might think. And have a wonderful day. Bye!